In 2020, McKay Coppins, a BYU graduate and staff writer at The Atlantic, landed a dream interview. He got to meet with President Russell M. Nelson for an article he was writing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints entitled The American Religion.
I obviously wrote about the interview at the time, but there was a lot of stuff I didn't work into that original story. And also, he did a lot of interesting and important work in the years since. So I had always kind of planned to write a sort of like reminiscence once he passed away. And, he lived much longer than I think anybody expected. And so I had all this kind of material just sitting there. And like a lot of people, I woke up on a Sunday morning to the news that he had died. So I was planning to write this piece. And then I went to church with my family. And while I was at church, I got the news alert about the shooting in Michigan and kind of immediately knew that the piece I was planning to write was going to be different.
Welcome to the Y Magazine podcast, bringing you ideas, stories, and voices from Brigham Young University. Today we get to talk to McKay Coppins about the interplay between his faith and his journalism career and how he became known as the Mormon Wikipedia in national media circles. I read his 2020 article, The American Religion, when it came out, and I just felt so seen. He did such a good job of explaining the basic history and doctrine, but also capturing the nuances of our culture. Then last week, when I was looking for words to explain how I felt after both losing our prophet and then the horrifying events in Michigan, McKay came through again, weaving the two events together in another article in The Atlantic entitled A Prophet's Diagnosis. This latest piece captured the deep anguish we were all feeling, but also addressed the question, how would President Nelson have responded to the violence in Michigan if he'd lived one more day? The article left me feeling understood, comforted, hopeful, and a little bit weepy. And so I was so excited to be able to talk to McKay Coppins about it. I'd love to start by just hearing the story of how you came to write this most recent piece.
It was interesting because the editor of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, he had come with me to meet President Nelson years earlier for that first interview. And, he had been on board for me to write another, kind of reminiscence. And then when he saw this news, he texted me and he said, first of all, I'm really sorry. And second of all, if you don't feel up to writing now, or if you want to wait, that's of course fine. But I was actually kind of grateful to have something to do over the next few days as, the news all came in about what had happened in Michigan. And I think a lot of people, including myself, were sort of grieving and trying to process it. And it was kind of an unexpected blessing to be able to spend those couple days thinking about President Nelson's legacy, his teachings, specifically his message of peacemaking, which felt even more urgent and important in the wake of this horrific violence. And so, I ended up kind of writing a piece about both things, about President Nelson and this shooting, and what we can do with this peacemaking message that he was so urgently giving us. And I have to say, like, it's funny, writing these things for The Atlantic was not always very natural for me. I'm a political reporter. My day job is not to write about, my own personal experiences with faith. But something that's been really great about my experience at The Atlantic is that my editors have really pushed me to write about religion and my own faith from a personal place, in addition to reporting and everything else. And I still do that. But their counsel has always been to not feel like I have to hide that. And I've been really grateful for that.
Which can also be very vulnerable though, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, that is the hardest part. I mean, there are some writers who kind of got into writing as a way to explore their own personal, lives and their demons, like there are personal essays. And I was always much more interested in telling other people's stories. I wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to write magazine profiles and biographies and books. And so because of that, it is definitely something that I've had to kind of get used to, is being willing to be that vulnerable. And I still don't think I'm fully there. Even this piece, I ended up staying up until like 2 a.m. to finish it. And I turned it into my editor. And I knew he would, get back to me in the morning once he read it and give me some edits and talk about it. And it was funny, like I did not sleep very well. I got probably like 4 or 5 hours of sleep. And the next morning I woke up and the first thought I had was, oh my gosh, I can't believe how like vulnerable and personal that was, what I just turned
Yeah.
in. Like I need to go claw some of it back,
Yeah, the classic
Uh,
vulnerability hangover, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And the next morning I kind of was like bracing for my editor to be like, look, it's a little too much, but he, was very supportive and he thought it was an important thing to write. And so I was grateful to him.
Well, my first reaction to the news was just being speechless. I had no words to give to this experience, and in fact, I saw it on my phone and I just continued getting ready for church, and I didn't even say anything to my husband. I didn't wanna deal with it, and obviously I started to do so and read more and learned more. But you talk a lot about that scripture, mourning with those who mourn and comforting those who stand in need of comfort, and you being able to give us some words to talk about this, which is what you do, that's your talent, that's your gift, but that is such a beautiful way to comfort those who stand in need of comfort, and so I very much appreciate that.
That's very kind of you to say. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I felt like it was mainly a blessing for me to have something to do to process it. But one thing I will say is that um, I actually I write about this in the piece, but on Monday night I drove back to our chapel. I live in Northern Virginia, just outside DC, and I wanted to go back, and I don't know why. I feel like I had this irrational instinct to like go check on the building,
Yeah,
And I went back and I literally just parked in the parking lot. It was empty. No one was there. I ended up writing a lot of that piece in the parking lot of the church,
really.
and the thing that was so beautiful about it was that there was, we have that sign in the front of the church that said visitors welcome. And somebody had left a bouquet of flowers on top of it. And to me, it was like a reminder of why, President Nelson was out there preaching this idea of peace in a world that is very much not peaceful. And it could be easy to be like cynical about that, to think that, he was basically preaching to deaf ears and nobody was going to, internalize this message. But it was also a reminder that there are people who still will take up that message. There is still so much good in the world. And that was the thing that really most struck me about President Nelson. I interviewed him right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the world
Another
was
big moment.
yeah, and I mean, the world was melting down. It felt apocalyptic and the mood was really bleak. And I had been kind of in quarantine with my family for almost 2 months by the time I interviewed him. And I I was, almost kind of wallowing in my interview with him. I kept talking about all the challenges we faced, and he was just so relentlessly optimistic. And I remember he said to me, it's important to remember there can be joy even in the saddest of times. And I think that that is how he lived his life, and that's how he would want us to live. And so it was important to me as a writer, as a journalist, in writing about this to not have the piece feel bleak. As sad as the news was, I wanted it to be hopeful, kind of as a way to honor President Nelson's legacy.
And that ending wrecked me as I was reading it last night. I fell apart when I read that about the bouquet, like, oh my gosh, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful ending.
I I, I appreciate that. I am not a person who shows a lot of emotion generally, and I think this week I've just been really like raw in a way that's kind
Yeah.
of unexpected to me, like uncharacteristically emotional. Like the smallest things will cause me to get choked up, and writing from a place of that kind of like emotion and rawness is again not something I'm used to. It's writing is usually much more like an intellectual like struggle for me, and that piece was much more written from the heart, I guess.
Well, and you mentioned in the article that you were familiar with the building because we all know what it looks like inside just from our experience with chapels. Like we've vacuumed those pews, we've
Yeah.
cleaned those bathrooms.
Yeah. And we've gone to 100 Christmas parties and trunk or
Yeah.
treats
Yeah.
and primary programs in buildings that looked exactly like that one. And we know how it smells, and we know how the what color the carpet probably was and what the walls feel like. And we unfortunately live in a country where there is a lot of violence, and we've seen it. But like, to see it in a place that feels so intimate and familiar and also sacred was really hard to process.
And what a gift, as you brought up also in the article, that the President Nelson basically gave us a playbook, right? For how to approach things like this, especially with the talk about peacemakers that he gave at conference. I mean, what a gift to tie those two together. I just really appreciate it. So,
Yeah, no, I think that I was talking to somebody today about how that talk Peacemakers Needed, I think, is going to be one of those talks that goes down as one of the great talks in church history, right? Like, there are certain talks we return to a lot. Um, President Benson's talk about pride, that's one that we still quote in sacrament meetings. And I think that that Peacemakers talk is going to be one that we return to again and again, kind of sadly, because I think that, at least from my vantage point as a reporter, I don't think we're going to lose the need to hear that in the years to
right.
come. I think we're in a very divided, polarized, contentious era. And I think that that kind of prophetic call to love our enemies and to build bridges of understanding and to reject the, what does he call, the venomous poison that defines our civic dialogue. Like, I think that that's going to become more and more important in the years ahead.
Right. And so I'd like to talk about, while you're reporting on some of these, difficult, challenging things that are happening, how does your faith impact the way that you approach these topics and deal with them, I guess?
Yeah, something that I recognized in myself in my early years as a reporter was that it would become very easy to get cynical as a political journalist in particular. But I think journalism in general, like certain other professions, you spend a lot of time kind of unearthing bad behavior by people in power, especially, right? And you also encounter a lot of bad faith arguments and a lot of lying and manipulation. And it can be very easy to almost involuntarily adopt a really grim view of humanity, you know? And I felt that kind of pull early on in my career. After BYU, I moved to New York with my wife, and I was in New York for 7 years, and then we moved to DC. But like, I just felt that kind of instinct to start to think the worst about everybody. And so I think that something my faith did for me was kind of push back against that instinct. It created, I think, a healthy tension, because I also think that as a journalist, it's important to not be naive and to not be a dupe, right? I think it is important to be skeptical of people in power, especially, but also to recognize that even people in power and everybody, even people who do bad things, are more complicated than we often are willing to admit. And that idea of loving your enemies, I think that a starting place is to try to understand your perceived enemies, right? And so part of what I tried to do, and I think my faith really informs this, is throughout my career is to not write from a place of trying to vilify or demonize, right? I'm
Yeah.
always, when I'm writing about a political figure, a presidential candidate, somebody who works in the White House, whatever, um, I try to be very clear-eyed, and I want to tell the truth about what they're doing. And if it's hurting people, I want to reveal that. But then at the same time, I also want to try to understand where they're coming from. Like, what's motivating them? How do they see themselves? And how do they see their project? How do they justify the things that they do? And one thing that I've really come to realize is that everyone in public life, even people who you might think, whatever your politics are just evil, craven, terrible people, all of them at some point in their lives or careers have felt this kind of tug of war between their ambition and their sense of right and wrong, right? But my religious belief that we are all children of God, that nobody is born evil, that we all have the light of Christ in us pushes me to try to humanize and understand people, even if they are doing bad things. And that's not to try to let them off the hook or excuse bad behavior, but the hope is that by explaining what motivates them and how they see themselves, it will kind of make everyone, across the political spectrum feel a little bit more empowered, a little bit more informed, a little bit more enlightened, and hopefully less angry and exhausted.
Right. And I'm curious if you have any advice for those of us who aren't journalists to kind of help make the political discourse more positive.
Yeah, I mean, I I know it's really hard, and I also know that something about, being some people who work in politics and people who write about politics, um, often condition themselves to not react emotionally to politics. And I think that's kind of a survival mechanism. And it's also important, at least like in my job, it's important for me to not be in a constant state of kind of emotional
Right.
outrage or anger, right?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't do
You
my
wouldn't
job, right?
sustain that. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, that's not to say that you lose your moral compass or you lose your sense of trying to, report the truth and expose wrongdoing or whatever. But I say all that as a preface because I recognize that the average person very naturally does respond emotionally to
Right.
politics. And like, I don't even know that it's realistic to say, oh, you shouldn't, like, you shouldn't react emotionally to politics. Like, politics is how we as a society litigate big questions of right and wrong and what our values are as a country. And so it makes sense that people feel very strongly about it. I guess like the two pieces of advice I always give when people ask questions like this is one, to keep in mind that if you are getting your news and information and commentary on any kind of social media platform, which probably describes almost everyone these days, that you should remember that the algorithms on these social media platforms are designed for maximum conflict, right? They're
Right.
designed to maximize engagement, to keep you on the apps, to keep you scrolling. And what they have figured out, and this is maybe a sad reflection on human nature, is that one of the easiest ways to keep people scrolling is to make them upset or angry and to get them to fight, right? To bait people into arguments, to bait people into debates, to name calling, to, finger pointing, recriminations, whatever. So, when you feel that instinct, when you see something on social media that makes you angry, like just remember, like that's probably by design. And I have gotten really good at taking note of when I'm having that kind of physical sensation of anger, right? Like I feel the rush of adrenaline, like I feel the brain chemistry changing. And I have the sense, I know that if I speak right now or type something right now, I'm probably gonna regret it.
Right.
And so I just try to take note of like, I'm having an emotional reaction right now. I'm going to step away from the keyboard. I'm going to put my phone away, even just for 1 minute. Like that 1 minute is often enough for me to kind of recalibrate, think rationally about how or whether I want to respond. And often the answer is that I don't want to respond. Like it's not worth it. This is not going to lead to a good faith dialogue. So that's my one piece of advice. And then kind of related to that is that in this media ecosystem that we're in, um, just be skeptical of any headline or piece of content or video that you see that perfectly validates your worldview and makes you think that your political enemies are all stupid and evil. When you see videos like that, be skeptical of them. Go find the context, watch the longer video that's longer than 17 seconds, right?
Right.
Go
Oh,
see if the headline is replicated in multiple other credible news sources beyond just like this one that you're seeing right now. Like just kind of, I guess, doubt your own like absolute certainty about the way the world is.
right.
That's my advice.
And dig for those primary sources because
Exactly.
they're out there if you look, but sometimes it's hard to find.
For sure.
I've
It takes a lot
Yeah.
more work, right?
Yeah.
Like, I get why people don't do it, but if you want to be serious about being a peacemaker, about having good kind of like civic hygiene and media hygiene, like it does take extra effort.
That's great. Well, I appreciated what you talked about in this recent article as well about your conversation that you had with President Nelson
Yeah.
about this need that people often feel and that you have yourself felt to separate your career and your faith. Can you tell us about that conversation that you had with him and what you learned?
Yeah. Well, so it was 2020. I had been assigned to write a kind of long, in depth feature about the church. And I had actually even kind of been reluctant to take the assignment because um, I was pretty new to the Atlantic at that point, and it was the first Trump term, and there was so much political news, and there was so much interest in political news, and that was kind of my beat. And I kind of felt like, wouldn't you rather have me profiling the vice president or focused on the biggest story in the world? But Jeff Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, he's long been fascinated by our faith, and he had always wanted to commission a really big, long, kind of definitive piece about Mormonism in America. And what he said was, look, I can find another writer to do it if you want. But, I have a Latter-day Saint writer on staff. So I feel like you should have right of first refusal. And so once I thought about that, I kind of felt like, you know, I want the ball, right? Like if
Yeah.
somebody is going to do this, I want to be the one to do it. But I was really struggling with it because I just didn't know how to approach a 9,000 word story about something that's so personal to me. Like,
Yeah.
do you do it as a reporter, as an observer? Do you try to pretend that you can have journalistic distance from a subject that literally has been at the center of your life for your whole life, And I just wasn't sure yet. And I hadn't started writing. I kind of was starting with the interview with the prophet. What was interesting is that I got to the room, and this was during the pandemic. So I had to go through a lot of, like safety health protocols just to get in the room with him. Um, and we were in Salt Lake, and it was this huge conference room where the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 meet together. And we sat down, and the first thing he did was ask if we could say a prayer. And he prayed for me and each one of my kids and my wife by name, which I was really touched by. Um, and then we started talking, and like 15 minutes into the conversation, he started talking about how we all carry various identities through life. And the idea was like you have your professional identity, and you're a parent, and you're a spouse, and you're a Latter-day Saint. And he was trying to, I think, build to this idea that the most important identity you have is it being a child of God. But actually, I actually interjected, which is embarrassing. I went back and looked at my transcript and saw that I interrupted him in that moment, which probably not the best form. But it was because this was something on my mind. Like he was speaking directly to something that I was kind of having anxiety about, and so I kind of told him. I said, "Yeah, I mean, it is. I find that it's very complicated to hold these different identities, and I often find myself compartmentalizing them, right?" And his eyes kind of lit up, like he got really excited, and he said, "Well, don't separate them." And I kind of laughed and said, "Oh yeah." And he said, "No, I'm serious. Don't separate them." And he told this story about how he had, when he was in medical school, a professor sort of criticized him for not separating his faith and his medical studies. And he told me, I remember thinking, why would I separate them? If it's true in one place, it's true in another. And it was such a profound insight. Like he talked about how, my study of the human body, of the human anatomy, strengthened my faith in the divine creative powers, right? And then Christian teachings about patience and forbearance and humility and meekness helped shape his kind of bedside manner and his behavior in the
Yeah.
operating room, right? Like though they didn't have to be separate, they informed each other. He was somebody who lived his life this way. He wasn't like a doctor when he was at the hospital and a Christian when he was at church. He was both things all the time. And it's funny, like I remember really like taking note of what he was saying and really internalizing it. But I don't think I realized in the moment how important that insight would be to me. And it really did end up shaping my approach to journalism and to my career and to my spiritual life. It really kind of underscored that I didn't need to try to separate being a journalist and being a Latter-day Saint and being a parent, like I could be fully all of these things, fully myself in every venue, and I would probably be better off for it.
Well, and they'll complement and strengthen each other, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I have found that. Really now looking back on the last 5 years of my life, I realized that that was sort of a pivotal moment in my life. In a way that I don't think I fully realized. And I think that like the thing that I found is that audiences, regardless of their faith, really appreciate the transparency and appreciate the authenticity. Like it would have been weird and honestly a little like suspicious even if I had hidden the fact that I was a member of the church while writing a 9,000 word feature about
Right.
the church. Like that
Right.
would have been really strange. Or if I had just kind of briefly mentioned it, but then not gone into my own personal experiences with it at all. And to their credit, my editors really kind of encouraged me in the writing of that piece to weave in my own personal story, right? So a lot of the story was about the history of the church. A lot of the story was reporting on the tensions within the church and the questions about what, the third century of the church would look like. And then there was this kind of third narrative vein where it was more about, growing up a member of the church in Massachusetts and serving my mission in Texas and attending a really kind of like diverse, quirky branch in Brooklyn. And like all of that stuff, I think helped the reader understand what I was writing much
Yeah.
better. Like there was kind of the texture of lived religion woven into the piece rather than just kind of an academic and journalistic study
Well,
of
yeah.
Mormonism.
It made it so much more interesting, and we weren't just hearing doctrine and history in that
Right.
article, we were hearing culture intertwined, and that's what made it come alive. So it's a great example of how to do that well.
I still now find, even when I'm not writing about religion or the church, that being very upfront about who I am and where I'm coming from and kind of what I believe is actually a really good jumping off point to provoke interesting conversations and interviews. Like I just interviewed somebody for a book actually that's completely unrelated to anything religious. But I could tell we were kind of talking past each other. And then I finally realized like, oh, here's the disconnect. Here's where I'm coming from like a religious place, like I believe X because of my faith. And my sense is you are not a religious person, so you don't believe X. And he was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then we were able to have like a more
Interesting.
constructive, revealing interview because I was more kind of forthright about my beliefs and who I was, and like, it wasn't me trying to, preach or convert. It was more just like, oh, I'm getting better information as a journalist and understanding this subject better because I was more authentic about my faith and who I am.
Well, and that goes back to this issue that we were talking about, being able to have political conversations with those with different beliefs. If we can show that curiosity and wonder where they're coming from and share where we're coming from, that is a great first step to be able to be open.
Yeah. The thing about, understanding your enemies, loving your enemies is like you have to first acknowledge that you are seen as an enemy to others, right? But maybe by virtue of just your religious identity or your politics or something that you have no control over. But like understanding that there are people out there who dislike you based on good or bad information, and then realizing like I want to reach out and connect to those people and like help them understand where I'm coming from, but I can only do that if I understand where they're coming from. The dialogue has to go both ways, and the good faith has to go both ways, or else it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. That is great advice. I appreciate it. I'd love to now kind of go back in time a little bit. At what point did you realize you wanted to go into journalism?
Um, so I, for literally as long as I can remember, wanted to be a writer. Like in first grade, I had a teacher who part of the activities that we would do in class is we would create little books, like we would draw pictures and write them, um, literally from that point on, I wanted to be a writer. That was all. That was always what I wanted to do, and for a long time, I thought I wanted to write fiction, and then I think it was around the time I was going into high school. I kind of got turned on to the idea of journalism. Ironically, at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s, it seemed like a more steady, solid career path in writing. Journalism has since been disrupted many times over as an industry. And so really from that point on, journalism at least was like a very live option for me. I really loved it. I edited my high school newspaper. It was really though, and it was at BYU actually, that I started to think seriously about the kind of journalism I wanted to do. And it was my freshman year, I took a journalism class, like one of the prerequisite classes to get into the communications program. And I still remember Professor Stoker taught this class where he had us read a Pulitzer winning series in the Oregonian newspaper. And it was written so, compellingly, and it was gripping and it read like fiction. And I remember it was kind of the first moment where I was like, oh, I can kind of try to achieve all of my my lofty literary writerly ambitions through journalism. Like I can write literary nonfiction, and that was my freshman year, and that kind of was the thing that made me realize, oh, this is what I really want to do. I will also say I was not 100% sure I would be able to do it. Like
Yeah.
obviously, like the more I learned about the journalism industry, the more I kind of learned that getting to spend 4 months on one article is a a privilege that not all writers and reporters get. And so I realized I would have to kind of work up to that point, but it gave me a goal to work.
Yeah. Well, and then you have to sit through all the jokes about how you'll just be working in fast food as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, and our class was kind of graduating into a really bad economy for journalism in particular. Like every newspaper and magazine in America was hemorrhaging jobs, and even some of our professors were kind of like, ugh, I don't know. They had
Good
had their own
luck.
careers in journalism, but they were like, good luck. I hope this works out. My favorite story though to tell about this is that when I wanted to propose to my now wife, we were at BYU together, and I called her dad to kind of ask for his blessing, and he did the correct fatherly thing and kind of like interviewed me. He was saying, "Well, what are your plans for after college?" And I said, I want to give journalism a try. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go out to New York. I'm going to get an internship in New York. I'm going to give it like a year, And if it doesn't work out, then I'll do either law school or business school. That was and I was kind of saying that to like put my future father-in-law's mind at ease, but also it was kind of my plan. I was like, look, if journalism doesn't work out, I'm going to have to do grad school, and I only learned much later that my father-in-law kind of said, okay, that sounds good. You have my blessing. And he hung up and he turned to my mother-in-law and said, so what do you think it's going to be, law school or business school? Like, he had already skipped ahead to the part where
Right?
journalism did not work out and I had to go to graduate school. And I feel like it was only in the like a few years ago that he was like, so this journalism thing, it kind of worked out for you.
So now I have to know, like, what happened after that 1 year?
Well, I had an internship at Newsweek, which I
Mhm.
actually was a BYU internship. It was the New York internship program that the comm school did, which was great. And Newsweek put the magazine up for sale like 2 weeks into my internship. And I remember they like gathered us all for an all hands meeting and announced it. And all the like longtime staffers there were like in shock and gasping. Literally remember somebody gasping. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I got an internship on this sinking ship, you know? But what ended up happening was that all these people ended up kind of frantically looking for other jobs. And so a ton of people left Newsweek over the next, couple months. And basically they just needed like bodies, they needed people to fill these jobs. And I was there as an intern. And so they offered me a very entry level reporting and research job. I was like amazingly small salary they were offering me, but it felt like we had won the lottery,
Right.
and then that was kind of it. It was enough of like a foothold in the national media, this kind of low paying entry level magazine job that I was able to stay and kind of build my career.
That's a great story. And I know that you've spoken to BYU journalism students about, the importance of having representatives of our faith in the media. What are some of the things that you tell those students?
Well, one thing that I say is that like I need some backup, like I need some. I would love more BYU alumni to come out and join me. I think that the stereotype is basically true that newsrooms, especially in places like New York and DC and LA, are pretty secular places. Although I have found some exceptions. Actually, The Atlantic has an unusual number of people of faith writing there of various faiths. But our tradition in particular, I don't think funnels a lot of people into media. And I think that a lot of the kind of misinformation and bad journalism about our faith is not done out of bad faith. It's really just like there are so few Latter-day Saints in newsrooms to kind of even bounce ideas off of or to fact check things with. I'm not even saying like Latter-day Saints are the only ones who can do good journalism about Mormonism, for example. You don't have to be a member of a certain faith tradition to write and report well on it, but like it is important to know some Latter-day Saints, to feel like you kind of have people you can go to say, hey, explain this concept to me. I mean, when I covered Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012, I was the only member of the church on the kind of traveling press bus where all the reporters from the various outlets kind of followed Romney around the country. And I became known as the Mormon Wikipedia because all these reporters at like NBC News and the Associated Press and the Washington Post would like, when they had to write a quick story on deadline that mentioned Mitt Romney's faith, they would just say, hey, McKay, come over here really quick. I have a question for you. Or like, can you read this paragraph? Is this accurate? And like, I was happy to do that, but there just are so few people from our background that are just in position to do that in all these newsrooms. And so
Yeah.
I think that's important. Yes, the careers, the industry is forever in flux and it's always changing and getting disrupted. But like that's true of a lot of industries these days. And especially in our kind of AI era, I think we're going to find that a very large number of white collar jobs are on the verge of getting disrupted. So if you are passionate about journalism, if you love it, if it's something that you want to do, I always tell people to just go for it.
I, for one, am very grateful that McKay decided to give it a go, and I hope that his advice encourages other hopeful journalists to do the same. You can find links to the 2 articles we discussed in our show notes, and I hope the most recent one especially gives you as much comfort and hope as it gave me. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Y Magazine podcast. This episode is based on an article in the fall issue of Y Magazine. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll also enjoy my conversation with Sarah Jane Weaver. Write it down, advice from the new Deseret news editor on recording your life. This episode was produced by me, Whitney Singley Archibald, with Emma Collier filling in for executive producer Brooklyn Hughes Romer. Original music and video and audio production by Jarrett Davis.